Welcome to the final video of my digital artifact, The Seasons of Change, an introspective look into John Glubb's A Fate of Empires. My name is Lachlan, and today I'm going to take you through the final stages of the cycle proposed by Glubb in his book, as well as a kind of look into the future, in the essence of what to kind of expect a little. We'll have a quick look at John Calhoun's social experiments. They're quite interesting, I reckon, and have a lot to do with these topics. And finally, we'll probably end on a bit of a philosophical note, because, well, this subject's a lot older than when this book was released in the 60s. So, to kick it off, we're going to look at the end of the Age of Decadence. So, like I said in the blog yesterday, the Age of Decadence has a lot of key traits, such as overspending in the military, great inequity of divide between the rich and the poor, a lot of niche tribes and groups springing up being hostile to one another, and a very authoritarian mindset in the sense that your ideals are right and everyone else is wrong, no questions asked. A lot of this is a result of boredom. Our ancestors were so successful that we really don't have any real threats to our stability except those we make ourselves. And in all honesty, we can't help ourselves. We love to cause our own problems. If you want further proof of this, I highly recommend that you look into the late Roman Republic, like I talked about yesterday. It shows a great deal of how all that success of the Romans kind of led to the huge wealth disparity between the 1% and the 99. Have a look at the French Revolution. It's a great example of how authoritarian you can get. Even if your ideals are egalitarian in nature, there was that whole time during the revolution known as the Terror where you couldn't oppose the revolution, you couldn't have any connections to the first or second estate, and if you weren't patriotic enough, all these things could get you sent on the road to the guillotine and your head being presented to everyone as the head of a traitor. You also see it a lot today, there's that huge divide and a lot of censorship going on in order to protect their ideals, even though really they should be challenged. You see a lot of censorship towards the end, and defensiveness in the attitudes and minds of most people. And this is where the conflicts arise, If both guys are willing to stick to their guns, then who's going to back down at the end of the day? You see a lot of these traits in nature as well. As I said at the start, John Calhoun did a social experiment in which he created the rat utopia. These rats were given everything like snazzy homes with comfortable beds, plenty of food, plenty of water, recreational activities, everything. Now, what they were expecting in this utopia was for a kind of equilibrium to be achieved where the rats just kind of had babies as they died off, and existed till the end of time. But what actually happened was the opposite. Due to this abundance of wealth and the lack of competition, a certain group of rats would actually hoard all the food. And using the food they'd hoard, they'd pay the biggest and strongest mice or rats to keep the rest of them away. As a result of this, you ended up with a cozy little 1% sitting in the most ideal spot, generally closest to the wealth, or in this case the food and the water, and everyone else spread out to their own corners within the enclosure. They had huge tribalism and groups of rats running together, in which if they ever came into conflict or contact with another group, it was all or nothing. They had copious amounts of sex, but they were going like crazy, like rabbits, but they wouldn't have the kids. Any children that were born were left to die or were eaten due to the mass starvation due to the hoarding of wealth by the big rats. And then eventually this all kind of led to its eventual collapse of society, with all of them being wiped out due to the lack of outside influence. You see, the difference between us and this enclosure is that we have some outside influences that can kind of kickstart us into reproducing again in an effort to maintain our survival. This is what we are going to cover in the next stage of this video, in which we look at what kind of comes after the Age of Decadence. I highly recommend you go down below and click on the link to this Mice Utopia experiment. It's very interesting. They did quite a few, covering all areas from the extreme survival needs to the most abundant. And with that, we come into the next part of the video, in which we finally cover the fall. So what comes after decadence? Well, obviously the fall itself. Is there any way to look at this in the same way that we've looked at the other ages, or John Glubb's looked at the other ages in his book? And the answer is yes, obviously. All end of empires kind of have similar traits, four in particular, the first being a cause or conflict. Generally it's a problem. It could be invaders, it could be social unrest between two sides, the wealth inequality, or the very climate itself. You know, we had that whole little ice age not 200 years ago that led into all those revolutions. This problem eventually grows to a point that it can divide the people into two or into more than two, and eventually chaos erupts between these groups as they kind of come into conflict for dominance. Eventually all this conflict culminates in the victory of a single party, with which has a general hero-like figure at the helm. You see this throughout the entirety of history, dating back to the ancient times to today. Figures like Alexander the Great, Octavian Augustus, Oliver Cromwell, who's not very looked upon favourably, Napoleon Bonaparte, and of course the most recent of which was Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Now these parties, once they get in control, they utilize these witch hunts and the book burnings that I mentioned a little bit earlier in order to kind of cement their power base. And once they've stabilized everything and established themselves as the authoritarian figures of their societies, they then catapult their nation into the next stage, which is, as you should know from the beginning of this digital artifact, the Age of Outburst, or the Age of Pioneers. And so we come to the end of the video. If you haven't got the hint by now, it is this part of the Empire life cycle discussed by Glob that I firmly believe will be our future over the next 50 years. Whether or not it'll be insanely violent or really civil, who knows? It can be anything really. At the end of the day, the only difference between each of these restarts and each of the end of the Age of Decadence is the way in which it takes form and how it eventually culminates. Sometimes it leads to reigns of terror like it did in France. It can lead to 100 years of war like it did with Japan and the Sengoku Jidai, or it can be done through relatively peaceful means such as the political process. At the end of the day though, they always come to an end and culminate with a new outburst and a new renewal of purpose within the people or within the established kingdom. So the most interesting thing about this Fate of Empires, their life cycle presented by Glob in his 1960s work, is that it's actually not a new topic. A lot of what I've discussed today has been discussed to death. In fact, it's most prominently found in a lot of religions around the world. Two of which stand out include Confucianism, which is a really abject study of it by Confucius, and how to best make the cycle run most smoothly, and of course there's Christianity, which is probably the first anti-establishment movement in history, because it solely revolves around being anti this system. In fact, it refers to it quite consistently as the beast system and the kingdom of Babylon, which is like a brand-all term for any empire throughout existence. Another interesting thing to note is that the Book of Revelations and its 7 seals, which begins with conquest and ends with catastrophe, is the very same 7-stage cycle that I have discussed with you over the past month. Now, the interesting thing about all these religions is that they all say the same thing, that this cycle isn't meant to be forever. And it's a sentiment that I kind of agree with too. One day, maybe in the future, we will break this cycle, but until then, it's just what it will be. I hope you enjoyed reading and listening to this digital artifact. Please go out, check some of the videos I've linked, and go visit their channels. I'll have them linked below as well. They're good sources of information on history and quite unbiased and not too hard to get through. Definitely read up on John Glubb's work. You can get access to that online through an ebook, again, linked below. It's a good read and a good look into how history really does play out, and how, more often than not, the past does end up being our future. My name is Lachlan Fivers. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and best of luck in whatever it is you seek to do. if I ever do make another video. Till then, I guess.